Frank Corva, Bitcoin Magazine here. I've been covering the Samourai case in New York in the Southern District. And Sjors, over to my left here, if you want a quick introduction, maybe.
Yeah, I'm Sjors Provoost. I'm based in the Netherlands, and I normally work on Bitcoin Core. But there's some things happening in the Netherlands that I'm also paying attention to, which we're going to talk about today.
Let's dive right in right there. So you've been in the courtroom for what's happening with the Tornado Cash trial.
Yes.
The portion of it that's happened in the Netherlands, it's also going to be happening in part in the Southern District of New York as well. I think that's actually a week from Monday. We're going to have, I think, one of the first hearings in the Southern District. But let's set the stage. Let's sort of talk about what's at stake right now when it comes to using Bitcoin crypto mixers. What is the environment right now? Maybe if you want to dive in on the Tornado Cash side, I'll give a little bit of an overview on the Samourai Wallet side.
Yeah, and maybe we want to go back a little bit further even.
Please.
There have been mixers before. Most of these would be custodial mixers. So essentially, you give your coins to some website, and that website gives you some coins back. And hopefully then there's no link between them, but the website could screw you over. And, well, there have been arrests around that. And then I guess we mostly not been paying attention to those as a community because we were thinking, well, they're custodials and custodians have different rules, so whatever. But now we're seeing, people getting arrested for building non-custodial tools and even autonomous tools, which I guess we can explain the differences there.
So let's start there. So one of the custodial tools is something like Bitcoin Fog, and we've seen there was a crackdown on Bitcoin Fog. When you talk about
Also a lot of very mixes that nobody's even heard of.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm actually not as familiar with that, but I think one of the things that's really important to differentiate here is that Tornado Cash is something very different than what Samourai was doing, the mixer with Samourai Wallet. So Tornado Cash, you have what you just called an autonomous tool. So we have a smart contract to which the keys were burned, which means that people can now use this thing. There's no administrator. Nobody can log in, change whatever parameters of the smart contract. It can just be used by whoever wants to use it now.
And in fact, it is still being used, even though some
correct.
of the people behind it are in prison. So that kind of proves that it's at least somewhat autonomous.
Yeah. And I think something really important to keep in mind here, when we talk about smart contracts, oftentimes people use the analogy of a vending machine. So a smart contract is an if-then protocol. If this happens, then you get this. The same way if you put $1 in a vending machine, you press A1, you get a Snickers bar. The difference is that not all smart contracts are alike in that some are completely autonomous, meaning even the person who owns the vending machine, let's say, who created it, no longer has the keys, so the smart contract operates independently, where then there are other smart contracts where people still have the keys, alterations can be made. In the case of Tornado Cash, you had an autonomous smart contract, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
So if we could
at least the core of it. So there was also, auxiliary smart contracts that provided the user interface, and those did still have access control, basically.
Understood. And for those who are not familiar with this as well, so we use this, whether it's Tornado Cash or Samourai, we're using this to preserve anonymity. The courts have...
To preserve privacy.
Privacy,
so there was a whole fun game, at least in the Dutch courtroom, between the prosecutors using the word anonymity consistently and the defense using the word privacy consistently, to the point where they started realizing they were doing that. But it has a different meaning, right?
No question.
I mean, it should be, yeah. Anyway, go on.
But let's dive in with the Dutch courtroom. So what has been established thus far based on the hearings that have taken place in the Netherlands?
Well, unfortunately, so the Tornado Cash folks had one person arrested here and one person arrested in the Netherlands, and those are completely separate cases, although they're using the same body of evidence, as far as I know, the same chats that were taken from phones. So Alexei Pertsev has been convicted in the Netherlands, at least during the first phase of the trial, for 5 years. I guess that's short by U.S. terms, but it was the maximum sentence he could get, because in the Netherlands, if you launder more than $1 million, then that's as much as you get.
Okay.
So that's bad. They're appealing it, and that appeal should be now-ish this year.
Okay. Any expectations for what you think might happen in the Southern District? And that's with, I'm going to get the name wrong. That's Roman Storm? Am I getting the name right?
I think so.
That's correct, yeah. Do you think you'll see a comparable sort of outcome? And I hadn't thought about this beforehand. Can they look at what happened in the Netherlands case, despite the fact that the law is different, and maybe use some of that as some sort of precedent for what might happen in the Southern District?
So I don't think so, because the interesting thing is it's just two different countries with completely different legal systems. You guys have jury trials with witnesses. It's going to be probably quite spectacular. Whereas in the Netherlands, it was, a little courtroom with maybe 5 journalists, which is a lot. Um, and just the lawyers talking, and also they're mostly referring to dossiers. So even though the trial is public, as a member, if you're just sitting there, you're just hearing them refer to page 375 of some document that you don't have access to.
Right.
So this is a problem too. So I have no idea what the outcome is here. You really have to ask lawyers here, and of course, the lawyers that are defending them will say that they're definitely going to win, and the prosecutor will say that they're definitely going to win. So I don't know how to judge that.
While he's not their lawyer, Zach Shapiro from the Bitcoin Policy Institute, who's also running the P2P Rights Fund, which is helping to raise money for defense in these trials, I think he's a little bit more realistic. I don't think he's super optimistic. I think he thinks there's a chance of winning, but I think also, I believe it was in one of the hearings for the Tornado Cash case here, we had the judge saying, I don't care what FinCEN guidance says. In FinCEN guidance, so FinCEN guidance came out from the Treasury in 2019. There's nothing there. Well, basically, what a lot of the lawyers are arguing is that, well, these are non-custodial products, so our team members are not actually touching this. We're not actually touching funds, so we can't be involved in illegal money transmitting. But the judge has now said, I don't care if you didn't touch the keys to this money. You are still part of this process of transmitting this money. Do you think that this is going to be something that could be superseded? Can we get past this initial? It's not a ruling from the judge, but it was a statement made in one of the pretrial hearings thus far.
Honestly, I don't know, but it touches on something interesting. So we have, as we said, there's custodial mixes where the mixing company does touch the coins, and then there is non-custodial mixes where the company doesn't, where nobody has custody over the coins. And as far as I know, on both sides of the pond, it's acknowledged that indeed there was no custody. The question is, does that matter? And then for the Tornado Cash situation, it's also autonomous, which is a separate discussion. So you have custody versus non-custody, and then you have autonomy versus running a website. And what happens in Europe is that, so you guys have a FinCEN guidance that people are like looking at as if it's like a biblical verse, basically.
It can be interpreted.
Yes.
Well, I guess the
biblical
biblical verses are
It can
too.
be interpreted, but you can also say, well, it's just guidance, so maybe you ignore the guidance. That's sort of the discussion here. But it is trying to, at least the way it's interpreted is to say, if you're not a custodian, like you don't have to do any of this money transmitter licensing stuff. Whereas in Europe, this is actually very clear. There is a European anti-money laundering directive, which specifically says that if you're not a custodian, you do not need a license. And that's also not contested in the courtroom. So even the prosecutor said, like, sure, you didn't need a money transmitter license, but money laundering is still a crime. So we're gonna punish you anyway.
And I think this might be a good place to switch over a little bit to the Samourai trial. So for those who are not familiar with the Samourai trial, and also you just said you might see kind of like hoopla in the courtroom in the United States, I can testify to the fact that you probably won't. I've been the only member of the press in all 4 of the pretrial hearings for the Samourai devs. I think now we're up to maybe 3 members of the press that were in the 4th hearing. So there is not a lot of attention on it, despite the fact that the legal precedent that will likely come from these cases will set the course for how we're able to legally transmit value across the internet moving forward. But for those who are not familiar with the Samourai case, so there are 2 charges that have been levied against them by the U.S. Department of Justice. The first being conspiracy to operate an unlicensed money transmitter business. The second being conspiracy to launder money. I think what's important here is that I think it seems like, based on the FinCEN guidance and also according to Zach Shapiro from BPI, the fact that we might have more FinCEN guidance come out before the trial begins in November might influence this in terms of the money transmission charges really not being thrown out, but making it much easier for the Samourai developers to win. The other side of the Samourai case is that they're being tried for conspiracy to commit money laundering. We know that the Samourai developers, or for those who don't, they were quite flagrant in sort of poking the bear, as the analogy or the idiom people use. Russian oligarchs posting on Twitter, Russian oligarchs come and use our service, and then apparently there's what's been hinted at in the courtroom by the prosecution, and I can't say this it's just based on my interpretation of being there and listening, is just wait until you see the correspondence that we have with, the Samurai devs and other people who are using the service. And we're still waiting on this sort of this discovery to be released. There's a tremendous amount of discovery in the case. The way it was described in the courtroom was that there's enough discovery where if you printed it out on paper, you could stack it to the moon and back 22 times. So there's a lot to be worked through here. But I think thinking about the Samurai case, one of the things to keep in mind is that while they might lose on the side of helping to facilitate money laundering, I hope they don't. I hope they didn't do that. It seems like, based on the interpretation of FinCEN guidance, and also we had 2 senators in the United States, I think it's Wyden from Colorado and Senator Lummis, wrote letters also saying that according to FinCEN guidance, they have done nothing wrong here in terms of money transmission. But the big question mark is, based on what we heard in the Tornado Cash hearing, the judge saying, I don't care whether you touch these keys or not, can we now interpret this guidance differently? And especially because we don't have pre-existing law on this.
Well, I think the answer is no, because again, the U.S. has its own legal system, and hopefully this appeal in the Netherlands will also change the result a bit. Because maybe go in a little bit what the prosecutor was trying to say, versus what the judge eventually did. So the prosecutors were making for Tornado Cash a very complicated argument, basically almost using tokenomics. So they were saying, okay, you guys have this smart contract, and yes, it's autonomous, at least parts of it, but some parts of it are not. But you guys have tokens, and those tokens will go up in value if criminals are using it, and also you have hired staff and they're doing work. So we look at it, Tornado Cash not just as the smart contract, but as this whole organization around it. So you can agree or disagree with that argument, but that's sort of what they tried to do. And then the judge kind of said, well, I don't care about any of that stuff. The fact that you wrote a smart contract that is unstoppable, the fact that you did that in the first place, that and you knew that it could have been used for money laundering, that is what makes you now responsible for that money laundering. So the judge actually went beyond what the prosecutor was asking for and saying, no, it doesn't matter that it's not custodial. It doesn't matter that it's autonomous. In fact, the fact that it's autonomous makes it worse because you should have kept control over the system. I think that type of argument here would hopefully not work at all, because it sounds like a problem with free speech and kind of being responsible for something that you created. I don't know.
And I think the free speech point is important to touch on. So I don't know.
Like if you invented guns, like, are you responsible now for all
everyone that's been
homicides?
shot? Right.
Sort of along those lines. Hopefully that just gets blown up in appeal.
Yeah. And for those who are unfamiliar, it was in the 90s. I think it was during the fight around PGP, pretty good privacy. We had the ruling that essentially code is free speech. And this is something that the defense, at least in the Samurai case, I know is going to put up as an argument. Is there anything, is that an argument that can be made in the Dutch courts or no?
We don't have that precedent that code is free speech. However, in practice, there's some, like, I guess there's some similar legal arguments around, say, hacking software. Okay. So if you are making software that can also be used for hacking, that's not a problem. If you're making software that can only be used for hacking and you're also making money for it, that could be a problem. But there's still some thresholds there.
Okay. And for those unaware, I mean, if you're, I'm sure if you're sitting here, you're sort of interested in this for reasons of preserving your own privacy. I'm curious to hear, did the defense make any sort of case that activists use this and that they have to use it, that people like the Navalny organization, Alexei Navalny, who ran against Putin, that one of the only ways for them to receive their donations was to have them put through crypto mixers first, mainly to preserve the privacy of their donors, right? We don't want to put the donors at risk, especially if they're donating from within Russia. Is any of this argument being made in the Dutch courts? Was this made that it's necessary in some situations?
I think it was kind of, but not strongly enough. So I'm hoping that in the appeal, they're going to put much more emphasis on the legitimate uses. But at the same time, I think there were organizations that were using Tornado Cash for paying salary, etc., and they sent letters to the judge, and those letters were not even mentioned in the verdict. So it's possible that there were these arguments might have been made on paper more than they were made orally, okay. But they did not show up at all, which is a problem.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think another issue in the United States, and I'll just kind of put this out there as a call to action now. I wrote a piece in Bitcoin Magazine around this, is that there's a lot of excitement right now around the strategic Bitcoin reserve. There's even good stuff like codifying the right for people to own their private keys. But to quote Craig Raw, who created Sparrow Wallet, one of the best Bitcoin wallets out there for those who don't use it, he said, I don't think the world is really ready for the amount. If we do move to more of a Bitcoin standard, Bitcoin proliferates, it becomes more widely used. I don't think the world is ready for the amount of transparency that we're about to see. And as I have conversations with politicians, I recently spoke with a number of prominent politicians, senators, congresspeople, representatives at the federal level and at lower levels. One of the things that comes up, we talk about all the stuff that they love to talk about right now, SBRs and the keys, and they're the heroes of the day right now. People in the Bitcoin community like politicians all of a sudden, which wasn't always the case in the history of the Bitcoin community. I watch them squirm in their seat when I bring up privacy. So part of the reason is that if something were to happen, if someone's using privacy tools and there were a terrorist attack as a result of that or something like that, obviously people are going to look back to the politicians. And I think the majority of what they're thinking right now is sort of like, I don't want to be on the hook. I don't want to be responsible in such a scenario. So it's easier for me to maybe either not talk about this situation or to err on the side of giving an ambiguous answer. So I'm just, before I forget, the call to action is more, if this isn't something that you're passionate about, even speaking with lower level, like state level representatives, and I would actually say the state level representatives are easier to have a conversation with. I think just the same way that we've educated politicians to say Bitcoin is not only used by criminals, ETH is not only used by criminals, blah, blah, blah. There's people who use it for very legitimate purposes, especially activists and people who need to maintain their privacy. It's going to be important to have this next discussion because as these trials move forward, there's going to be hopefully more media attention, though there hasn't been a lot thus far. There's going to be a lot of education that's necessary around this, same way we've educated people about, I don't know, Bitcoin as a store of value, importance of private keys, etc. So before I forget, just wanted to put that out there. If this is something that you're passionate about, education is necessary. Writing your local politicians is necessary. One of my colleagues, Shinobi, has an article online. I could see if I can maybe share it via, I don't know, MIT, this venue somehow, where we created a template to start addressing politicians. You could just use this to say that this case is really important. And I think right now there's also a lot of momentum. We're seeing other people being pardoned, obviously Ross being one of the bigger characters right now. But we haven't seen too much leniency on this front yet. So I think it's going to take an organic push from everybody involved, everybody that cares about that, to make the case that, sure, there may be some bad actors that use it. To also make the case that Chainalysis's stats tend to be terrible, not very good. They tend to say there's many more criminals using public blockchains than there actually are, but that there are many people across the globe who use this. But then also saying to a politician or someone in power, a policymaker, do you want your entire balance of whatever crypto asset you're using on a public blockchain be able to be visible to someone? Because if you, without a mixer, without being able to put this through some sort of to put it through a mixer to maintain some semblance of privacy, it's going to make the world a public place in ways that I don't think people are necessarily ready for. Let me hand it back over to you.
Yeah, to maybe end on a more cynical note, there is two interests.
Sorry.
Really, you could say there's kind of roughly two ways that people care about Bitcoin. One of them is number go up, and the other is the more censorship-resistant money. And I think in order to have the censorship resistance, you also need privacy. They kind of come together because if they can't see you, they can't get you. And just a lot of people only care about the number go up thing. Now, you can make the case for an enlightened self-interest that Bitcoin will not be number go up if the censorship resistance is undermined to the point where the government can just print more of it. But I don't know if we need to do that or that people need to figure this out themselves. But I'm not surprised that people are not helping these privacy tools at all when they're seeing the number go up.
Okay, so they're distracted, you're saying?
I say they don't care about it. They care about the number go up, and that's why they might let some people out of prison, but I don't think they're going to get involved in this privacy discussion because they don't want to make the argument that terrorists could use Bitcoin or something like that.
It's a tough thing for them to have to own if that does happen.
Yeah.
Is that fair? Yeah. I agree with that. That is part of the difficulty of the conversation, and I get that to some level. I'm going to stop it there, though. Let's open the floor to Q&A. If anybody has any questions, we'll do our best to answer here. Did we put everybody to sleep? Sorry about that. Before lunch, I know.
Have you considered some of the irony that institutions might be your best friends in this space? Because from a trading strategy standpoint, they don't want to give up and give away front running to their info and their private.
That's interesting.
No, because if you have all these institutions are holding their coins at some giant custodian and they do all the trades off chain, so I don't think they have too much of an on chain privacy. Now, if all these ETFs were doing self custody, then yeah, there would definitely be an incentive for them to care about their own privacy. Maybe I'm being too cynical here, but
it's good to have a cynic next to me. I tend to be too optimistic, so.
Yeah, I've been surprised that institutions like the EFF and the ACLU haven't gotten more involved in this. And so I'm curious if, Frank, you in particular, have you tried to talk to them? Because this seems like it could leak into encrypted messaging and other areas where maybe they play more of a role.
No, I think that's a really, really, really important conversation. I would say the EFF probably knows a little bit more about what's going on than the ACLU, but you've just given me some homework, some people to reach out to. But that's a great idea. I think that's really important. It is sort of it's a civil rights issue essentially, and it needs to be brought to that level for sure. Appreciate that.
So this was briefly brought up in the court case in the Netherlands. The analogy with text, basically. So nobody is saying that Signal is responsible for all crime organized on it. And then the prosecutor just said, well, data is different. Data or text is different from money. And therefore, that's it. That's the whole argument. So this is a disconnect that you're seeing in the legal system. So financial data privacy seems easier to defend than financial privacy. And I would say there's a political problem when it comes to things like EFF, etc.
Yeah.
Crypto just has a bad rep. Bitcoin maybe even worse. And they don't want to touch it. The only good example there is Molly White, who is typically very critical of Bitcoin stuff.
Yes.
And she wrote an article very strongly in defense of the Tornado Cash and Samurai people. So there's hope.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I'm not cynical.
Said the cynic. Said the cynic.
Yeah. Are there any kind of like prosecutions against like the people who actually committed like fraud using these at all, or is it all just focused on the?
That's a fantastic question. I would say the difficulty there is that because they're using something that mixes the coins, it may be hard to tie stuff back to them. I don't know enough about that, though. Maybe you know more.
The Tornado Cash prosecution was triggered, seems very obviously, by the fact that North Korea was using it. Otherwise, it would have been under the radar. And so prosecuting North Korea is being handled, I guess, through these sanctions and all this stuff, but they're just untouchable. But I would say there are, criminals are getting arrested all the time, and then they confiscate money, and they may or may not have used the mixer.
To piggyback on that, one of the things that was interesting, I wrote a piece, I think it was right when the Samurai news came out. I interviewed two prominent activists, and one of them said to me, like, Russian oligarchs don't need this. They have a bunch of other schemes that they can use to do this. Like these are like the last people we should be worried about using. They could do this through real estate schemes, through other sorts of schemes. This really doesn't apply to them in the way that the prosecution is trying to make it out. And obviously in the way that, the Samurai devs did not help by, inviting them on Twitter to come use the technology.
No, I mean, the Netherlands is a paradise for Russian oligarchs. You can buy real estate, but also just these corporations are very easy to move funds around. But, the argument from whataboutism basically is never, doesn't really work that well, especially in court.
I think that's fair. Yeah, that he has a little bit more knowledge there. Any final questions? How much time do we have? I just want to make sure we're okay. We're good? Okay.
And of course, in the case of the North Koreans, it was clear they were using it. So it's not...
With Tornado Cash.
It's not yeah.
Which isn't good.
Maybe a little bit out there question, but I think with the sanctions, it's really interesting to think about it from like a global trade perspective, especially with oil. There's like a lot of BRICS chatter for like a dollar alternative. At the same time, we have all this tariff stuff. Do you guys think any of, that bears on or like trickles down into the court cases where like there's a higher agenda to like maintain the dollar sovereignty and making sure oil trade goes through the dollar? But if you get like a mixer that's really powerful, you could trade oil for Bitcoin and nobody would know if you did it in a small enough size.
I think I think it would be difficult for the sorts of volume, the sorts of money going through. I think it would be I think Lynn Alden wrote in Broken Money something like Bitcoin is kind of good because when somebody tries to put like serious money through the system, you can see that in the mempool, it's going to be really, even if you do put it through a mixer, it's going to be tough to see. But also from what I've seen about countries saying that they want to start doing oil trade, like Bolivia just recently said, we're going to start using Bitcoin for oil payments. I mean, they're telegraphing. They're making it public. I don't know that anonymizing the transaction is going to do much to change the dynamic that they're trying to establish there.
Yeah, well, the fact that they're telegraphing things could also mean that they're really just trying to send a political message and not actually serious about using Bitcoin for these things. But maybe then again, I'm being too cynical.
Still, it's a very yin and yang scenario here. It feels good. Yeah. Are we good? Do we have any more questions? Final questions or anything?
I think that's all the time we have.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Frank. Thanks, George.